There is a particular kind of person in this world, someone who can imagine extraordinary futures, someone who dreams in vivid detail, success, recognition, freedom, purpose. In their mind, they have already lived 1,000 lives, achieved 1,000 victories, and overcome every obstacle. And yet, in reality, they remain exactly where they are. There is something almost magical about standing at the edge of a possibility that has not yet been touched. In that space, everything feels alive, flexible, and perfect. The dream exists without resistance. It does not argue back, it does not demand effort, and it does not expose weaknesses. It simply exists as a beautiful projection of what life could become. And this is where the seduction begins, because in this untouched state, the dream belongs entirely to you, shaped by your desires, protected from reality, and free from the imperfections that inevitably come with action. It feels safe there, almost sacred, as if beginning would somehow contaminate its purity. The mind, in its quiet cleverness, learns to return to this space again and again. It rehearses scenarios where success unfolds naturally, where obstacles dissolve, where everything aligns at the right moment. These imagined victories create a powerful emotional response, a sense of achievement without effort, a satisfaction that mimics progress, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the brain begins to confuse imagination with movement. It rewards the act of dreaming as if something real has been accomplished. That is where the danger deepens, because the person begins to feel closer to their goal without ever taking a single step toward it. What makes possibility so addictive is that it protects the dreamer from confrontation. As long as something remains untested, it cannot fail. As long as it stays in the realm of imagination, it cannot disappoint. There is no rejection, no criticism, no moment of doubt that shakes confidence. Everything remains intact, untouched by the friction of reality. And so, instead of moving forward, the individual unconsciously chooses to stay still, preserving the dream rather than risking its collapse. They begin to guard it, not by building it, but by avoiding the very actions that would give it life. There is also a subtle illusion of control within possibility. When you dream, you decide the outcome. You control the pace, the results, the narrative. But action removes that illusion. Once you begin, you enter a world where outcomes are uncertain, where effort does not always guarantee success, and where you must adapt, struggle, and sometimes fail. For many, this loss of control feels threatening. It challenges the image they have created of themselves. It forces them to encounter limits they would rather not see. And so, remaining in possibility becomes a way of maintaining control over a life that has not yet been tested. Over time, this attachment to possibility creates a quiet paralysis. The dream grows larger, more detailed, more emotionally charged, but the distance between the dream and reality also grows. What once felt inspiring begins to carry a subtle weight, a quiet awareness that something is missing. The person may not admit it openly, but there is an internal tension between who they imagine themselves to be and what they actually do each day. And instead of resolving this tension through action, they often respond by dreaming even more, as if expanding the vision could somehow compensate for the lack of movement. The most deceptive part of this process is how harmless it appears. Dreaming is often praised. It is associated with ambition, creativity, and vision. And these qualities are indeed valuable, but only when they are connected to action. Without action, dreaming becomes a closed loop, a self-contained experience that never interacts with reality. It begins to replace growth instead of fueling it. The person is no longer using dreams as a starting point, but as a destination in itself, a place they return to for comfort rather than a place they leave in order to build something meaningful. There is a very convincing story the mind knows how to tell, and it sounds responsible, intelligent, even admirable. It says, "I am preparing." It whispers that more knowledge is needed, more clarity, more certainty before taking the first real step. On the surface, this appears wise. After all, preparation is necessary for growth. But there is a subtle line where preparation stops being useful and begins to serve a different purpose. It becomes a shield, carefully constructed to protect a person from something deeper that they may not want to face. This is where fear begins to disguise itself, not as something obvious or dramatic, but as something reasonable. It hides behind research, endless planning, and the constant search for the perfect strategy. The person reads more, watches more, thinks more, and convinces themselves that they are getting closer to action. Yet, if you observe closely, nothing actually begins. Days pass, then weeks, then months, and the starting point remains untouched. What appears to be movement is often just motion without direction, a cycle that creates the illusion of progress while avoiding the risk that comes with doing. Fear, in this form, is not loud. It does not announce itself with panic or visible anxiety. Instead, it operates quietly, shaping decisions in a way that feels logical. It asks questions that seem valid. What if you are not good enough yet? What if there is a better way you have not discovered? What if starting now leads to failure that could have been avoided with more preparation? These questions feel protective, almost helpful, but they slowly trap the individual in a loop where the moment of action is always postponed to a future that never arrives. One of the most powerful aspects of this disguised fear is how it protects the ego. As long as something is not attempted, the person can maintain the belief that they are capable of succeeding. The dream remains intact, untouched by reality. The moment action begins, however, that belief is tested. There is a possibility of making mistakes, of producing something imperfect, of facing criticism or rejection. And for many, this is not just uncomfortable. It feels threatening to their sense of identity. So instead of confronting that possibility, they continue preparing, as if more knowledge could eliminate uncertainty entirely. There is also a hidden perfectionism within this pattern, the desire to begin only when everything is clear, when every step is mapped out, when confidence is complete. But life does not work this way. Clarity often comes through action, not before it. Confidence is built by doing, not by waiting. Yet the person caught in this cycle believes that they must feel ready before they begin, not realizing that readiness is often the result of starting, not the prerequisite for it. And so they wait, and while they wait, the fear remains unchallenged, growing stronger with time. Another layer of this illusion is the comfort it provides. Preparing feels safe. It does not expose the individual to judgment or failure. It allows them to stay within a controlled environment where outcomes are predictable. There is no risk in thinking, no danger in planning, no vulnerability in imagining. But this safety comes at a cost. It prevents the person from entering the real world where growth happens, where skills are developed, where resilience is built. And the longer they stay in preparation, the harder it becomes to leave it, because the gap between intention and action continues to widen. What makes this pattern especially difficult to recognize is that it is often socially accepted, even encouraged. People admire those who are thoughtful, who analyze, who take their time before making decisions. But there is a difference between thoughtful preparation and endless postponement. One leads to action, the other replaces it. And when preparation becomes a permanent state, it is no longer serving the dream. It is protecting the person from the very experience that could transform their life. There is a strange kind of comfort that exists in believing you are someone capable of greatness without ever having to prove it through action. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet deeply influential in shaping behavior. A person begins to build an identity not through what they do, but through what they imagine they could do. This imagined version of the self becomes emotionally satisfying. It feels complete, even though it has never been tested. In this space, there is no risk of failure, No confrontation with limitations, no need to struggle through uncertainty. The identity exists in a protected state, untouched by reality. This creates a powerful internal contradiction. On one hand, the individual sees themselves as someone with potential, ambition, and insight. On the other hand, their daily actions do not reflect that identity. But instead of resolving this contradiction through effort, the mind often chooses a different path. It strengthens the belief in potential while avoiding the discomfort required to turn that potential into reality. This allows the person to maintain a positive self-image without engaging in the work that would challenge or refine it. There is a quiet emotional reward in saying, "I could do this." It gives a sense of possibility without demanding commitment. It allows the mind to feel aligned with success while remaining distant from the process of earning it. Over time, these internal statements become part of identity. The person begins to associate themselves with ideas of talent, intelligence, or capability that are not grounded in experience but in imagination. And because this identity feels good, it becomes something worth protecting. Effort, however, introduces a different reality. It exposes gaps in knowledge, inconsistencies in discipline, and the presence of struggle. It forces the imagined identity to meet the real world, where outcomes are uncertain and progress is often uneven. This meeting point can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the internal story that has been carefully maintained. And so, instead of engaging with effort, the person may unconsciously avoid situations that could test their identity. They stay in environments where their potential is never questioned, only assumed. What makes this pattern particularly powerful is that it does not feel like avoidance. It feels like preservation. The individual may genuinely believe they are protecting their future self, waiting for the right conditions or ensuring that when they finally begin, they will do so properly. But beneath this reasoning, there is often a deeper resistance to the vulnerability that comes with action. Because action does not just create results, it creates feedback. And feedback can be uncomfortable when it does not align with the internal image a person holds of themselves. Over time, this creates a widening gap between identity and behavior. The larger this gap becomes, the more tension arises internally. The person may feel frustration, dissatisfaction, or a quiet sense that something is missing. Yet instead of addressing the gap through consistent action, they may reinforce their identity even further through thought, discussion, or imagination. They speak about what they could do, what they might become, what they are capable of achieving under the right circumstances. Each of these reinforces the identity without requiring proof. There is also a social dimension to this comfort. People often respond positively to expressions of potential. They encourage, validate, and affirm the idea that someone has great things ahead. This external reinforcement can deepen the attachment to identity without effort. It becomes easier to be seen as someone who has promise than to become someone who has results. And because society often rewards vision more than execution in early stages, the illusion remains unchallenged for longer than expected. The longer this pattern continues, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish between who a person believes they are and what they have actually developed. The identity becomes increasingly abstract, less connected to lived experience and more connected to repeated thoughts. Meanwhile, the absence of effort quietly limits growth, narrowing opportunities that could have shaped a more grounded and tested sense of self. The comfort remains, but it slowly replaces transformation, leaving the individual in a space where they are always becoming something in theory, but rarely in practice. There is a belief that quietly shapes many lives without ever being questioned. It is the belief that there will always be more time. More time to start, more time to prepare, more time to become the person you intend to be. This belief does not usually appear as a bold statement. It exists more like an assumption, a background thought that makes postponement feel safe. It allows a person to delay action without feeling the weight of urgency, because somewhere in the mind there is always a future version of life where everything will eventually be addressed. This illusion of time creates a false sense of comfort. It tells the individual that today is not critical, that missing this moment is not significant, that opportunities will repeat themselves in a similar form later. And because time itself is invisible and continuous, it becomes easy to underestimate its value. Unlike physical resources, time does not appear to be depleted in a noticeable way until a much later stage. This makes it uniquely deceptive. It feels abundant precisely because it cannot be seen diminishing in real time. Within this illusion, procrastination does not feel like a decision with consequences. It feels like a neutral pause. The mind convinces itself that delaying action is harmless, that nothing is truly being lost, only temporarily deferred. But what is often overlooked is that time does not simply pass without cost. It takes with it energy levels, emotional momentum, and the freshness of ideas that once felt urgent and alive. What was once clear and inspiring gradually becomes distant, heavier, and more complicated the longer it is delayed. There is also a psychological mechanism that reinforces this illusion. People tend to imagine their future selves as more capable, more disciplined, and more ready than their present selves. This creates a mental gap where responsibility is shifted forward. The current self avoids discomfort by assuming that a future version will handle it more efficiently. But this future version is never fully reached because the same thinking pattern repeats itself. Each present moment becomes another point of postponement, always trusting that a better version of self will eventually take over. What makes this particularly powerful is that life rarely provides a clear signal that time is running out. There is no alarm that sounds when opportunities begin to fade. Instead, change happens gradually. A person only realizes the impact of lost time when they look back and notice how much has shifted without their participation. Skills that were never developed become harder to learn. Opportunities that were once accessible become more competitive. Energy that once felt abundant becomes more limited. But by then, the illusion has already done its work. The illusion of time also affects motivation. When a person believes they have unlimited time, urgency disappears. And without urgency, action becomes optional rather than necessary. The mind struggles to prioritize what does not feel immediate. Tasks that could transform a life remain perpetually postponed because they do not carry the pressure of now. Instead, they are placed in an imagined future where conditions will somehow be more favorable, more structured, more perfect. Another subtle aspect of this illusion is how it interacts with emotional states. People often wait for motivation to align before they act. They assume that at some point in the future, they will naturally feel more driven, more focused, more prepared. But motivation is not a stable condition that arrives on schedule. It is often created through action, not before it. Yet the illusion of time allows the person to believe that waiting is a valid strategy, that delay is not avoidance but preparation for a better internal state. As this pattern continues, time begins to lose its perceived urgency entirely. Days start to blend into each other, intentions remain constant, but execution remains absent. The distance between what is imagined and what is done slowly expands, not because of a lack of ability, but because of a consistent belief that there will always be another moment to begin. And in that repeated assumption, time continues to move forward without resistance, carrying with it possibilities that were never acted upon. There is a hidden form of attachment that many people never recognize within themselves. It is not an attachment to results, nor to discipline, nor even to success itself. It is an attachment to the feeling of dreaming. The mind learns, often without awareness, that imagining a better future produces a powerful emotional response. It brings hope, excitement, a sense of meaning, and even a temporary escape from present dissatisfaction. This emotional reward can become so compelling that the act of dreaming begins to serve as its own destination, separate from any intention of turning it into reality. In this state, dreaming is no longer just a mental projection of possibility. It becomes an emotional experience that provides comfort. The individual can sit quietly and construct entire futures where everything unfolds perfectly. They can feel the satisfaction of achievement without having to endure uncertainty, effort, or risk. This creates a powerful internal environment where the brain receives positive stimulation without requiring any external action. And because the emotional reward is immediate and consistent, it becomes easy to return to it repeatedly. Over time, this pattern develops into a kind of emotional dependency. When reality feels heavy, uncertain, or unsatisfying, the mind naturally retreats into imagination. There, everything is adjustable. Problems can be solved instantly. Success can be visualized without delay. The emotional discomfort of the present moment is replaced by the emotional pleasure of possibility. This shift is subtle, but it changes the role of dreams entirely. They are no longer a bridge toward action, but a refuge from it. What makes this addiction so difficult to notice is that dreaming is socially accepted and even encouraged. People are often praised for having vision, ambition, and imagination. These qualities are valuable, but only when they are connected to movement. Without action, they become experiences that are consumed internally rather than expressed externally. And because no one typically questions a person for thinking about their future, this pattern can continue for long periods without interruption or reflection. There is also a neurological aspect to this emotional cycle. The brain responds to imagined success in a similar way to small, real achievements. It releases feelings of satisfaction and anticipation, creating a reward loop that reinforces the behavior. The more a person engages in vivid mental imagery of success, the more their mind associates that imagery with fulfillment. As a result, the urgency to pursue actual progress can diminish because the emotional system is already receiving a form of reward without requiring effort or risk. This creates a quiet substitution effect. Emotional satisfaction from imagination begins to replace the emotional satisfaction that would normally come from real progress. The individual may feel as though they are moving forward because they experience strong emotions related to their goals, but in reality, nothing external has changed. The dream remains in the same place, while only the internal experience of it has been repeatedly activated. Another layer of this addiction is its role in identity preservation. Dreaming allows a person to maintain a version of themselves that feels capable, inspired, and destined for something greater. As long as the dream remains untested, this identity remains intact. There is no confrontation with failure, no evidence of limitation, no disruption of the internal narrative. This makes dreaming emotionally safe, even when life outside remains unchanged. The comfort lies not in progress, but in the uninterrupted belief that progress is always possible. The danger in this emotional cycle is that it gradually reduces the pressure to act. When imagination consistently provides emotional relief, the discomfort that normally drives change becomes less urgent. Frustration, dissatisfaction, or restlessness that could have motivated action is softened by the ability to escape into thought. And so, instead of these emotions becoming catalysts for movement, they are absorbed and neutralized within the space of dreaming itself. As this pattern continues, a subtle imbalance forms. The inner world becomes rich, active, and emotionally charged, while the outer world remains largely unchanged. The person may feel deeply connected to their aspirations, yet increasingly disconnected from the practical steps required to reach them. The dream remains emotionally alive, but materially inactive, sustained by repetition rather than execution. There comes a point in every person's inner journey where everything becomes quiet, not because the questions are answered, but because they can no longer be avoided. After all the imagining, all the planning, all the waiting, there is a moment that does not announce itself loudly, but arrives with a strange simplicity. It is the moment where the mind stops offering explanations and starts presenting only two directions. Either something begins or everything remains as it has always been. This is not a dramatic turning point in appearance, but internally it carries the weight of every postponed decision that came before it. In this moment, the illusion that has been carefully maintained begins to lose its stability. The illusion is not broken by failure or external pressure, but by the quiet recognition that thinking, planning, and imagining have reached their limit. There is nothing left for them to offer that has not already been experienced internally. The emotional satisfaction of dreaming starts to feel repetitive. The sense of preparation begins to feel circular, and the belief that someday will naturally transform into action begins to lose its emotional support. What remains is a simple awareness that nothing outside has changed, even though much has been lived inside. Action at this stage is no longer just a decision about productivity or progress. It becomes a confrontation with reality itself, because action introduces something that imagination never can: consequence. Once something is begun, it exists outside the control of thought. It can succeed, it can fail, it can evolve in unexpected ways. It is no longer protected by the mind's ability to adjust outcomes. This is why action feels heavier than intention. It removes the safety of possibility and replaces it with exposure. This exposure is where many hesitate, not because they lack desire, but because desire alone is not enough to shield them from uncertainty. When a person remains in imagination, they are both creator and observer of their world. But when they act, they become participants in a system that does not always respond in predictable ways. Effort may not immediately produce results. Direction may need to be corrected. Identity may need to be rebuilt through experience rather than assumption. And this shift can feel uncomfortable because it demands surrender of control over outcomes that were once fully shaped by thought. Yet within this discomfort lies the only real transition from illusion to reality. The illusion survives as long as everything remains conceptual. It thrives in delay, in postponement, in repeated planning without execution. But the moment action begins, however small, the illusion is interrupted. Reality responds. Feedback appears. Something changes outside the mind. And this change, even if imperfect, marks the beginning of something that imagination alone could never produce. There is also a silent tension in this moment between identity and behavior. The person must now align what they believe about themselves with what they are actually willing to do. If they have long identified as someone capable of great things, action becomes the test of that belief. Without action, identity remains theoretical. With action, identity becomes evidence-based. And this shift is not always comfortable because it exposes the difference between self-perception and lived experience. The difficulty is not in knowing what to do. In most cases, awareness is already present. The difficulty lies in crossing the threshold from internal certainty to external expression. This threshold is where hesitation lives. It is where fear disguises itself one last time as caution, as timing, as readiness. But beneath all of these, there is a simple truth. Nothing changes until something is done. At this point, life stops responding to intention alone. It begins responding to behavior. The mind can no longer substitute thought for movement. The weight of accumulated ideas begins to press against the present moment, asking for resolution. And in that space, the individual faces a quiet but definitive division between two ways of existing. One that continues to simulate progress internally, and one that finally steps into the uncertainty of becoming something real. Everything that has been explored leads to a very simple but uncomfortable realization. The distance between a dream and a reality is not made of talent, intelligence, or opportunity, but of repeated action or repeated avoidance. People who dream big but do nothing are not missing vision. They are not lacking ideas. What they often lack is the willingness to move from a world that feels safe inside the mind to a world that responds unpredictably outside of it. Dreams, when left untouched, remain pure. They stay protected from failure, criticism, and imperfection, but they also remain powerless. The moment a person decides to act, something changes that imagination alone can never produce. Life begins to respond. Effort begins to take shape. Feedback begins to arrive. And through that process, a person stops being only a thinker of possibilities and starts becoming a participant in reality. There is no single dramatic moment where transformation happens. It is not found in motivation or inspiration alone. It is found in the small, often uncomfortable decision to begin without guarantees. And in that beginning, something essential is revealed. Whether a dream was meant to remain an internal comfort or become an external experience shaped through persistence, correction, and time. What remains ultimately is not the size of what was once imagined, but the honesty of what was done with it.